Okay, welcome everybody. We just went live here at our fourth Parkside chat. We've been so pleased. We've had really great attendance. Thank you all for coming. We're going to wait a couple of minutes for folks to log in. And while we're doing that, I was just chatting with Charis Kubrin, our wonderful guest today, a little bit beforehand. And I thought maybe she could tell us all why she got interested in criminology. She's a professor in the Department of Criminology, Law and Society, as I think most of you know. So I'm always curious why people chose the career they chose. So Charis, why did you get interested in criminology?
Well, I guess I never really wanted to stop going to school. I mean, and I guess that's not so much about my love of criminology, but after I went to college, I didn't feel I was done. I wasn't ready to leave the classroom experience. And so for me, graduate school was, I guess, a natural extension of that. And I went to the University of Washington for grad school in sociology. But I had also applied to a number of programs. I was a double major in college, sociology and Spanish language and literature. And I also had applied to a few programs that address sort of my interests in Spanish language and literature, in particular US-Mexico relations. So I had applied for grad schools in that area, but also sociology. I had also applied to the Peace Corps. But anyway, yeah, to go to Oaxaca, Mexico, which I ended up turning down because I got into the University of Washington sociology PhD program, and it was a great opportunity. And my parents, who may be listening to this right now, but they talked me out of the Peace Corps and into grad school because they knew it was such a great opportunity. And I really, like I said, didn't want to leave the classroom, and I loved grad school. 7 long years, but at the end, I decided on criminology mainly because I gelled very closely with the professors of my criminology courses at the University of Washington, but there was not an area of sociology that I'm not interested in, whether it's political sociology, demography, race and ethnicity, all of it interested me, but ended up in criminology.
Well, we're glad you did, and we're glad to have you here today. It looks like
Thank
most
you.
of our attendees have logged in. So why don't we get started? And I hope, welcome. Again, I'm Nancy Guerra, the Dean, and we have with us today Professor Charis Kubrin, who you just met. I hope that you had a chance to watch the video. If you didn't, we're going to ask Charis to do a little bit of a recap of some of the key points. And if you did see it, well, it'll be another recap for you as well. So if you could start, Charis, by maybe telling us a little bit about the relation of crime and the pandemic. Has crime gone up? Has crime gone down? Is that related to specific crimes, specific locations? And I think maybe we can talk a little bit about what do we think is going to happen when we're back to work. I was reading something about in the 1918 pandemic, crime went down, and then when everybody went back out, crime went up again, actually higher than it was before. So that might be some cause for concern. So maybe you could just give us kind of the key points, a little summary of the video. That would be fantastic.
Sure. So I guess I did a little experiment. I asked 10 people I knew what they thought was happening with crime during the pandemic. Some people said up, some people said down, but nobody said staying the same. And that makes sense, because when you think of all that has been happening during this pandemic, I mean, everything from social distancing, closing down bars and restaurants, schools and businesses, the prohibition of public gatherings, very little international, even national travel. It's not that difficult to figure out that this is going to have an impact on crime in one major way, but whether it goes up or down, we can debate. But nobody said we expect crime to stay the same, and they're absolutely right. Statistics show, not just in the US, but worldwide, that pretty much following COVID, crime has plummeted. And this is directly related to when cities or states enacted stay-at-home orders. So what you can see is, if you look city by city, pretty much we see most violent and property crime drastically reducing following stay-at-home orders. Again, not just within the United States, but worldwide. So in Latin America and South Africa, we see crime rates plummeting. And you see, if you just do a quick perusal of newspaper headlines these days, you'll see titles like crime rates plummeting around the world, or the New York Times just ran an article a few days ago. They called the crime drop a pandemic bright spot, for example. So overall, crime, violent and property, is down. And there is some, however, variability across place, as we criminologists know. Not all cities experience crime drops or crime increases equally. And then within a given city, of course, certain neighborhoods are going to experience things differently. So there's a lot of devil in the details kind of thing. And in terms of the key crimes that most people are interested in, what we call the uniform crime reports, the murder, rape, robbery, assault, burglary, larceny, and auto thefts, there are two crimes that are experiencing slight upticks according to the data, and that is auto theft, and that's partly because vehicles are largely being left unattended during the pandemic, and also commercial robberies. So it turns out residential burglaries of the home are down because people are now in their homes all day long. And so opportunity to engage in residential burglary is down. However, commercial burglary is up because businesses are left unattended during the pandemic. So a bit of a mixed bag. And we see this in California. The Public Policy Institute of California just did a really nice report looking at what's going on in 4 major cities throughout the state. So it was like Los Angeles, San Diego, Oakland, and San Francisco. And they looked at police calls for service data. And what they found was that across all cities, there were sizable drops in both property and violent crime. And in some cases, upwards of 50% of property crime and upwards of 30% of violent crimes decreasing following stay-at-home orders. But they also found upticks in commercial burglary, like I mentioned. And my colleague George Tita in CLS recently published a study where he compared crime in Los Angeles and Indianapolis, and he found some similarities in terms of drops across the 2 cities, but also differences. But one similarity that he found that I think is worth talking about is the impact of COVID-19 on domestic violence. And in his study and in others recently published, Alex Beccaro at UT Dallas just published a paper. We see a big spike unfortunately, we see a big spike in domestic violence and child abuse cases following COVID-19. In some cases, not surprisingly. And many experts think that, in fact, it's even worse than what's being reported because a lot of the mandatory reporters that would normally call in instances of abuse, for example, school officials or after-school officials are not interacting with the children in this case. So probably unreported. So the other crime that seems to be going up in spite of the sort of bigger picture going down trends that we see is white collar crime, corporate crime, and fraud. We spoke about this in the video. A key question criminologists are grappling with is, are these crime reductions that we're seeing in the streets being moved online? So, right, drug arrests, for example, are down in city after city. Is the sale of drugs moving online, for example, being displaced online? Is fraud occurring in much greater numbers online as people are moving more of their lives online, doing more transactions online during the pandemic, that sort of thing. And then the third crime that I think we need to be paying attention to because it's bucking the trend is hate crime. And reports of hate crime are up. And this is not particularly surprising. If you look historically at pandemics, it's often the case that there is a scapegoating of minorities going on when you have pandemics, and this pandemic is no different. And so I've seen anecdotally and also read in the newspapers that there's been, that Asians have increasingly been targeted in hate crimes, both here in the United States as well as abroad. So that kind of gives, I think, an overall picture of what crime is doing. Again, there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of questions that we have around those trends. You raised the question of what's going to happen once we already are loosening the stay-at-home orders. And that's an open question at this point.
Well, one thing that struck me just listening to you talk is, is this really saying that so much crime is just opportunity?
Right. So that's a great question for theorists in particular in criminology. I'm particularly interested in kind of what this natural experiment, if you will allow us to say about key debates in the field, like is crime reflective of motivation or opportunity or some combination of both? I think it's some combination of both, of course. But also how these trends allow us to interrogate the major theories of our field. So we have certain theories like routine activities theory that focuses really on the role of opportunity, right? If the theory argues that in order for a crime to take place, you have to have a motivated offender, a suitable target, in the absence of capable guardians. And you can think of, with things closing down, those three things converging in space and time at a much lower rate than they did prior to closing down. And so we would expect crimes to go down. We also have theories, that focus on motivation to engage in crime. Strain theory, for example, is one of our key theories in the field that focuses on stressors that are related to increased offending, whether that's economic strain or other forms of strain. And then we have theories that focus on things like informal and formal social control. So formal social control, what the police, what the criminal justice system is doing, and informal social control, what we're doing in the community to prevent crime. So these trends allow us to begin to put to test some of the key theories in our field, and it'll be interesting to see what we find as we move forward with research on these topics.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by that. And, I wonder, since a lot of the work I do is around compassion and empathy and social emotional skills, and I'm a psychologist, so I think a bit more about motivation. And, it's pretty clear how opportunities shift. And in some way you can see like domestic violence goes up because you have more opportunity because you're around your partner or your kids all the time. And they're probably, fights emerge, conflicts emerge. But you wonder whether or not this idea that we're all in this together, that everybody gets impacted, not only in the US, but just all around the world, in some way can't be harnessed to motivate people to be part of the common good, to think of the community and think of society and not just think about their own need. But I think it's interesting, and I don't know if theories account for this. It's sort of a trade-off because on the other hand, I think people are feeling like their needs are not being met and they're pent up and they're getting crazy and they just want to go out without a mask or do whatever it is they want.
Oh, absolutely.
So how would you analyze kind of motivational shifts during this? Because there's so many different motivations.
Well, I'm going to take the easy route out on that and say that, of course, it's a combination of motivation and opportunity, right? I mean, opportunity explains some variation, but motivation for sure explains some variation. I think we can ask a series of questions that speak to these theories. Like one question that speaks, I think, to motivation and opportunity together is the role of the role of the economic impacts of the pandemic, right? A lot of criminologists are asking, beyond the public health issues around COVID-19 themselves, what will the consequences of the economic downturn be for crime rates? And the knee-jerk response is, we would expect crime to just skyrocket because the economic stressors that a lot of people are experiencing, poverty, unemployment, right? All of these things seem to push people to be motivated to engage in opportunistic kinds of crimes. This is why we need good research. It turns out that at least hasn't been the case when we look at similar economic downturns of the past. Like, for example, if you look at research from the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, similar predictions were being made. Despite the fact that during that time, the economic output was plunging and the employment rate was soaring and consumer confidence hit this historical low, we did not see major crime rates rise. We did not see a major rise in crime rates following that economic downturn. So there's a real complex relationship with things like poverty, unemployment, and crime that I think requires consideration of both motivation, opportunity, and there's going to be a lot to study with respect to that. But I think the knee-jerk assumption that we're going to see crime rates skyrocket because of the economic downturn, that at least has not been determined in prior research on this.
Well, and here's maybe where psychologists can join with criminologists and sociologists, because it also makes me think that when everybody's in an economic downturn, well, I'm not the one who's disadvantaged. Everyone's disadvantaged, so I don't feel so bad. It's
Right.
when you get something and I don't, and
Yep.
I'm going to say, why don't I have it?
That is
So
a long-standing debate in our field, and it's between the absolute poverty versus relative poverty argument. Is it right? Is it an absolute sort of thing, or is it compared to what? And that debate still rages on in the field. But I think a lot of research shows that it's the relative poverty that often has the biggest impact.
well, it's like, I don't like wearing a mask. I don't like staying at home. But if everybody else is, okay, I'm fine with it. But if I'm the only person that has to stay at home and wear a mask, I'm like, why am I wearing a mask and you're not? So it's
Right.
really interesting to think about it that way. Let me ask you one more question, and then we'll turn to, I see we're getting some questions in our Q&A. And please start, asking. Now's your opportunity to hear from an expert. So fill our Q&A with questions, and we'll try to get to all of them. It's just interesting, and this is I don't want to throw you with this question, but being a criminologist, one of the issues that's coming up on campus, because you were talking about informal social control, is how should we enforce people wearing masks? So the university is going to require that everybody on campus wear a mask. We actually had a long conversation at our dean's meeting on, well, how are we going to enforce that? Are the police going to come if they don't? Is it going to be a violation? Are we kicking them off campus? Are people just going to be part of the solution? Is it peer pressure? So what would you do if I asked you, what should we do, Charis, to make sure people wear masks? Because some people just don't. They don't, as we see from the highest office, they just don't feel like it.
That is a really difficult question. I mean, yeah, this is where the role of informal social control comes in. To what extent can we get people to buy into the common value that it's good for everybody if we all wear masks, right? Sometimes informal social control and that pressure breaks down and people don't follow the rule. Then the question is, well, what role can formal social control, the policing of it, come through? I mean, one really interesting thing that I think speaks to this broader question is what formal social control is doing right now with respect to actual crimes, the street crimes that I mentioned before. You may or may not be surprised to know that police are arresting many fewer people than they have before, in part because they don't want to fill the jails with individuals, particularly for lower, by the way, this is for lower level offenses. We're not talking about serious crimes here, but for lower level offenses, they're issuing citations rather than making arrests. They don't want to fill the jails up and have COVID spread among the population there in jails. Prosecutors are prosecuting at a lower rate at this moment because they also don't want to fill jails and have COVID spread. So courts are also reducing amounts of cash bail. Our jails and prisons currently are releasing individuals who have committed very low-level offenses. In some cases, the Prison Policy Initiative just issued a really interesting report. They found that the average jail in the United States has already released 30% of its population. The average prison in the United States has already released 5% of its population. So we are actually lessening formal control at the moment for a number of reasons, but majorly because we're concerned about the spread of this virus and the well-being of individuals, including corrections officers who are testing positive as well. And it's interesting because crime has not skyrocketed up following the release of all of these individuals. And this suggests to me that at least for some group of individuals, we can change what we're doing without necessarily risking public safety. So I'm not sure that answers your question, what should campus be doing about getting people to wear masks? But I do find it interesting that at this moment in time, we are pulling back on aggressive enforcement. And by the way, we can talk about what's happening in the news right now with cases of police brutality. That's a separate issue. But in general, we are pulling back on enforcement of very low-level crimes. And, of course, we have to do the studies and see what the impact of that is. But it seems to not be causing crime rates to rise in a serious manner. And that raises the question, how can our criminal justice system change in light of what we're learning through this pandemic, if you will?
Well, and that could be a real silver lining, because we certainly like to lock people up in the US, and lock them up for victimless crimes, lock them up for petty crimes, lock them up for jumping bail or not having money to make bail, for parole violations. So maybe there's a silver lining if we see, hey, it's okay.
Well, and as you well know, well before this pandemic started, California was in a massive experiment. It still is in a massive experiment of prison downsizing. In my own research, along with grad student Brad Bartos and Carol Saron, Professor Carol Saron, we have looked at the impact of these massive reforms on crime and public safety in California. And what we found is that these huge reforms that have taken thousands of people out of our state prisons, again, very low level offenses, has really not caused crime to go up. So, you know, this is more of this is happening now even on a greater level with the pandemic. And it just raises a lot of questions about the promise of criminal justice reform and a lot of unanswered questions, but questions I'd love to research on down the line at some point.
No, it's going to be really interesting. I know on campus, I actually mentioned that we had thought about putting cameras. I mean, people have cameras in their gardens and in their kitchens and everywhere, that we would just put cameras in some of the computer labs and some of the more actively engaged spaces, because I know the research on that even if cameras aren't working, they actually do have some degree of deterrence.
I have a lot to say about cameras.
Okay, why don't you say something? I know I wasn't too well received. People thought I was like super cop or something, and I'm not.
It's, you know, there's other countries, South Korea, for example, cameras are everywhere. And, you know, the question is, what is the effectiveness of that? And then any effectiveness that is gained in terms of deterring crime has to be considered in the context of our rights lost, or what that means for privacy. And so, you know, whatever a study finds or a group of studies finds, and now there's been meta-analyses of like CCTV cameras, like closed caption television cameras, right? They show very small reductions in the amount of crime. So not tons of crime is deterred. And then there's questions of displacement, which is, okay, well, where there's a camera, am I just going to move my enterprise and engage in drug selling there, or gang activity there? That putting that issue aside, we really have to think carefully as a society about whether any reductions gained in crimes decreased, you know, if that might be offset by privacy issues. I don't have the answer to that. I think it raises a set of really important questions.
Well, this is an interesting one, because we're not trying to deter a crime. We just want people to wear their face masks.
Oh, right. Going back to the face mask.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard it's a real issue of how, you know, the 6-foot rule you can enforce a little better, because I'll move back if you're too close to me. You know, 2 people can be involved in it. But the face mask is really hard to monitor. And people, as we know, have kind of varied beliefs about it. And it protects others from you, really, more than you from others. So it's an interesting, you know, it's not really a crime, but I don't know, this is going to be a new world of how we have to figure out ways of informal social control. I mean, it's almost like taking your own bag to the grocery store. You know, at some point, the peer pressure is such that I feel super guilty. If I forget it, I go back to my car and get it, you know, so maybe we'll have to do that with.
I know my colleagues across the country are doing tons of research on these very issues, including what predicts whether people obey the rules during a pandemic, right?
Oh, fantastic.
And that's not something that I'm an expert in, but I look forward to reading the studies of my colleagues that will help inform, you know, whether it's deviant behavior or, I mean, it's not necessarily crime, but sort of a broader set of behaviors. I think, yeah, I look forward to reading that research.
And if we have some graduate students on today, maybe they'll be interested in doing that. It would actually be quite interesting on campus, because my guess is it'll be a natural experiment. There'll be a fair amount of variation within the same context, which is the university, and it probably won't really be different in terms of any of the conditions. It's just one dean wants to do this, one dean wants to do that. So, or we could even randomly assign if we really want to be good. Well, let me turn to some of the questions, because now I see we're getting a fair number of questions. And maybe the first one, kind of to build on what you've been talking about, is what crimes do you anticipate rising higher post-pandemic?
Oh, gosh. And I really don't like forecasting kinds of questions.
I know, but we won't hold you to it.
No, I know. I mean, I guess I would say crimes of opportunity that involve public spaces, because that's what we see the greatest reductions in. I mean, there, you know, crime has, we can get crime to go up, we can get crime to go down, but there is sort of, you know, a general level at which crime, at least for certain places, tends to stay, absent major shifts or changes. And what we've seen is the biggest reductions, like I said, in California, those 4 cities that were in the study, upwards of 50%, really around crimes of opportunity, the burglary, residential burglaries, the robberies, that sort of thing. And so I expect those crimes to not necessarily skyrocket up, but return to their previous levels, if you will. Or one way to think about it is whatever they were doing or however they were trending just prior to the pandemic. So it's important to also consider pre-pandemic crime trends, because there was something going on in a location, a city, for example, or a neighborhood that represents existing conditions. Then the pandemic comes in as a natural experiment. Unless those conditions have changed, we would expect crime to kind of go back there. So I guess a lot of opportunity crimes, and then I would expect some violent crimes to go up, certainly say assault and homicide, unfortunately, simply because people are now back, they're interacting with each other. Once the bars open, once people are out in public spaces, arguments, can very easily turn lethal if, with guns and alcohol and drugs and that sort of thing. So whether they will go beyond sort of pre-existing pandemic levels or not is an unanswered question, but I do think those will be the crimes that we should be keeping an eye on.
Well, and actually you mentioned guns. I was kind of struck by the fact that gun sales went up during the pandemic.
Oh, not only did they go up,
they
exponentially went up.
And why do you think that happened? Was it one person, the same person who has a gun buying more guns, or was it more people buying a gun?
So that's the key question, right? There's no doubt that gun sales have skyrocketed. And I forget the numbers directly, but I know that gun sales, for example, in the month of March compared to gun sales in March of 2019, just completely different, 2 to 3 times higher. So that we know that people are purchasing guns in large quantities. I think the key question to determine the why is whether we just see people who already own firearms stockpiling more, or actually new people that have never purchased firearms before buying them for the first time. So I think the why is linked to that. And at this point, I don't know that we have good data that differentiates those two.
I was just wondering, if you've never owned a gun and you're purchasing it for the first time, you couldn't get training anywhere because everything's shut down. So
absolutely. My guess is it's people that already own guns that are purchasing more guns, but I'm waiting to see the data on that. I think fear is an important component of this, anxiety. We have a gun culture in the United States, problematically, in my opinion. And so people do see firearms as a resolver of solutions, whatever the problem may be. It's a solution, it resolves problems. And so, I don't know in this particular pandemic why it skyrocketed as much as it did, but I think there's a lot of my colleagues that study gun violence in our department in Criminology, Law, and Society. I hope they get on this exact research question and figure out how gun violence will shift following this pandemic, given the availability of so many more firearms.
Yeah, it's kind of scary. Well, and here's a related question. Speaking of guns and shootings, someone asked, school shootings are down during coronavirus. I get it that they're not at school. That's very good. You're very sharp. But what might it mean about large gatherings and their correlation with increased mass shootings?
Right. So that's been, to me, a really profound thing, is to not hear about a school shooting or not to hear about mass shootings in the way that we had prior to the pandemic. There is no doubt that unless we do something drastic, as people go back to their normal way of lives and the stay-at-home orders are lifted and we go about business as usual, even though it'll have changed, obviously, we can expect to see a recurrence of school shootings and mass violence. And that is very worrisome to me. And that is something that needs to be addressed, whether we're talking about guns or broader policy, or, however we're dealing with that, we're going to have to deal with that moving forward. There's no doubt about that in my mind. This just really put it on pause, if you will.
Right. No, for sure. Well, let me move to a slightly different topic. You mentioned earlier on the issues of racism and picking groups to target and blame, and how that really always increases when people are afraid or in situations like a pandemic. So one of our attendees asked, do you think that when and if the university opens up, yes, we are going to open up, there will be a spike in violence and racism against our Asian students because of all the China virus and et cetera, et cetera?
So
I
I
know
already,
there's been reports, right?
that's a great question. And I already think there has been, maybe not on campus in particular because campus is closed, but we've already seen higher reported instances of hate crime. And, you know, our own Val Janess studies hate crime. And, you know, I'd be really interested in hearing her take on what we can expect as the country opens back up. But we're already seeing rises in hate crimes, primarily directed towards Asian Americans, who are being blamed for the pandemic in a lot of different ways. This is not just happening in the US, this is worldwide. So I don't have the data on hand on this, but I have read a few studies that have looked at this. We're seeing it with the beginning of research starting to come out, and we're also hearing about it anecdotally. And so there's no doubt that this is going to be a continued problem for a while post this pandemic.
What do you think we can do at UCI, for example?
Well, I think we need to educate people about what this, you know, how this pandemic started. Make sure that people are being aware of, I mean, I still think some people believe that this was artificially constructed, right, by, you know, in China, and that in fact individuals are to blame for purposefully spreading the virus. And so I think educating people about that, making people aware of the stereotypes and assumptions that people are having around the virus, you know, will go a long way. I don't study hate crime myself. I think that is a perfect question for my colleague, Dr. Janess. So I'd really, in terms of how do we curb this, how do we stop this, I would really like to hear from her on that, actually.
Well, and I know we try not to be political in these Parkside chats, but it's hard not to be at some level, and it is one of our questions, so I'll allow it. When, you know, you have leadership in the country promoting hate and promoting fake news and not promoting truth about an actual disease, and then how do you counteract what the, you know, the message is that we're all getting? And that leads to the question, which is, has Trump broke the First Amendment by possibly inciting violence, not only just hate against, because it's the China virus, but actually inciting violence with his looting leads to shooting tweet? I mean, I think we have to talk about that, given the timeliness and given just the horror, you know, that all of us felt.
Wow. These are really difficult issues. I really don't care to give Donald Trump's tweets even. I mean, I know that they're important, and I know that people are affected by them, and I know they have consequences. I also don't like to draw any more attention to them than is absolutely necessary. I would rather speak about what's happening with police violence and the most recent case of racialized police violence, because I think that's a problem that is bigger than just Donald Trump and his Twitter account and what is happening in this country more broadly.
And actually that leads to another question then, perfect segue, which is, do you think that what is happening in Minneapolis has a higher chance of continuing and spreading because of the angst people are feeling due to COVID-19?
That's a good question. I mean, when I initially heard about what happened to George Floyd and saw the video, I watched the video and it brought me immediately back to Eric Garner, however many years prior. I mean, literally down to the words, "I can't breathe." It was very difficult to watch that video, but I watched it. You know, initially I thought, well, this has nothing to do with the pandemic, because the problem of racialized police violence, as many policing scholars will tell you, is a historical one. So this is bigger than the pandemic. There are instances of racialized police violence going back decades, if not hundreds of years. I teach C7, which is Introduction to Criminology, Law, and Society at UC Irvine, 400 students every year. And one of the documentaries that I show in that class is a documentary called Every Mother's Son. I don't know if you've heard about it. It came out in 2004, and it's a documentary that traces the lives of the mothers of 3 young men that have been shot and killed by the police in New York. And including the Amadou Diallo case, which a lot of people have heard of. It's Amadou Diallo, Anthony Baez, and Gary Bush. And it follows what happened with their cases, how they were killed by the police, and then the crusade that their mothers engaged on to reform the police so that this wouldn't happen again. And it's amazing what they were able to accomplish, at least theoretically. I mean, they were activists like you wouldn't believe, bringing as much attention as they could to the problem. And these were cases that occurred in the 1990s. And I show this documentary to my students, and then I ask them to compare that to examples of high profile cases today, including something like a George Floyd case, or more recently, Breonna Taylor, if I were teaching this class again. And I ask them to make comparisons about the cases. And the conclusion that they largely come to is, wow, 30 years ago, we were working on this issue. 30 years later, things really haven't changed that much. And so in some ways, this is unrelated to the pandemic in that this is a systematic problem that has occurred over and repeatedly. On the other hand, it's important to ask, how might the conditions of the pandemic play into this? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that question is. How situations, people's frustrations, whether they're economic or concerns about other white collar crimes that are happening. I mean, I know when I heard the senators were selling stock following a COVID briefing, right? You know, it's maddening. While we're asking people to pull their pants up and hang in there, we've got other people abusing the system. And so there's got to be some frustration around that sort of thing. So I think it's a combination of both history, but also the times at the moment.
Well, it seems like we've done so much training that you hear so much about diversity training and, you know, all these kinds of new techniques and sensitivity that we're trying to do, and implicit bias. And I guess the question is, why do you think things haven't really changed? Is racism so deeply entrenched in? It's probably a few. There are probably lots of good cops, and it's always
absolutely.
Few.
I mean, I know a lot of wonderful cops that are very upset about what happened, who believe that the officer involved, all 4 officers, should be charged, but they're also, I think
that was charged today.
Yeah, right. I found out earlier this morning, charged with manslaughter. So I know a lot of police officers I've spoken to are very upset about this. They've spent their careers dedicated to working with the community, their local community, to make, you know, a stronger police community relations. So, I mean, there's that part of it too. But let's see, what was the first part of the question you asked? Sorry, I just had a flash of,
what's working? Why is this not working? Right.
Sorry, I had a flash there of a former police captain of the Anaheim department that I've gotten to know. His name is Joe Vargas, over the last several years, who to me represents the best of policing. He dedicated his whole life to developing police community relations, and I've seen it firsthand. And, you know, so I've seen the other side of things, but you know, the trainings are important, but at the end of the day, do the trainings change police department culture? And culture is a really hard thing to shift, organizational culture. And again, we have great faculty at UCI that could tell you all about organizational culture, including my colleague, Dr. Carol Saron, who's written a lot about culture and organizational culture. But, you know, the question is, how has the culture of police departments truly shifted over time? And I'm I'm not an expert in this, so I would leave that for other researchers to comment on. But it seems to me that we've not done a lot to really change that police department culture on things like use of force, you know, and other kinds of policies and practices that lead to this. You know, at the end of the day, racialized police violence is exactly that, it's racialized. I have a young son, and I don't have the burden of worrying that he is going to be, I forget, was it 7 minutes with the shoe on the neck? I mean, it's very upsetting. It's very upsetting to talk about. And that's mainly in large part because he's white. So that is a fact. And I think, yeah, I guess there's just a lot of complex issues to this, and some of it is police department culture, other of it is history. There's a lot going on.
Well, and I'll go back to my psychologist hat, and some of it is probably individual screening and how we select people in to a context that would allow for you to actually abuse your power in many, many ways, not just that.
Right.
It's like if you're an alcoholic, you really don't want to be a bartender. I don't know that, you know, we do enough screening to get at really the sort of racist beliefs or power issues that may then unveil. But yeah, now that you mentioned culture.
Going back to that, can I just say one thing? Because one thing that struck me about this was that this individual officer, the one that was charged today, had a history of like 18 or 20 previous problematic behaviors, right? That, I mean, so there's a history there. So there's a failure of the department to address what turned out to be a deadly series of events that you know, arrived at this event just recently. You know, why was that not addressed in a serious way? And if you see the documentary that I mentioned before, going back to the 1990s with those police officers, it was a similar thing. It was a group of officers who had a history of complaints lodged against them, a history of police brutality that the department chose to overlook or just, you know, a slap on the hand. So there's a history there that needs to be brought out and accounted for.
Well, that's really good advice in terms of looking at individual players rather than throwing under the bus the whole department. And I know that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior.
Right.
We need to take it seriously. But now that you mentioned culture, let me switch to a couple of other questions, taking culture to a different level. And two related questions are, what about global crime trends? Are they mirroring the US? And related to that, in places like the favelas of Brazil, where crime was already rampant, has coronavirus led to a decrease in crimes in these settings?
Wow, excellent question. So on the first one, what I can say, again, anecdotally, because the numbers are still coming in and it's very difficult to get comparable numbers. But in fact, these declines have happened worldwide. So the United States is not unique in experiencing a major crime decline. You can find instances of crime declines all over the globe. Again, though, the devil's in the details, and there's probably way more variability than we're aware of yet. So even some cities, I was just reading an article the other day, Mexico City, high number of homicides still occurring, right? We've seen homicides just drop all over the United States. In Mexico, they're not. They're staying the same, even increasing. And then we see now slowly with release data, some cities are experiencing homicides like Chicago and Philly and that sort of thing. So, you know, I think globally, yes, crimes have gone down. That is true as a general pattern, but that's not particularly useful because I think we see much more variability at lower levels of aggregation when we're talking about cities or even communities.
And what do you think of in the favelas or the very marginalized communities where people are living together, you know, in very crowded conditions? I don't know how social distancing is even possible. Do you know anything about what's happening there? Do you have any kind of ideas?
That is an excellent question. And I wouldn't even try to answer it because I haven't seen any data on that. So at this point, I don't know how at that local level, what's going on there.
Yeah, I think the opportunity would still exist because people are, a lot of favela life is kind of indoor outdoor, and people are out on the streets much more because that's how they get around and manage their daily lives. So you might even think crime would go up because there'd be more opportunities for conflict. People would be frustrated. They would have less access to economic resources. They might be fighting actually over resources, but I don't know. I haven't seen any data coming in on that at all.
Yeah, I
So
haven't either. And that's all plausible. I mean, I think those are all plausible arguments. I haven't seen the data, and I don't know enough about the local context to go beyond sort of that, just saying that.
we're developing all kinds of dissertation ideas for all of our graduate students who are watching, and for those interested in international crime rates. So we don't have that much time. Let me turn to two other topics. One is about juveniles, and someone says, I work with juveniles. Have you seen an increase in crimes for juveniles? If so, what types of crimes?
No, I have. I mean, what I've read before is mainly focusing on UCR crimes. And so I think it's sort of for the population as a whole. I don't know what's specifically happening just in terms of disaggregating the data for juveniles. Because crime is mainly committed by young people, right? Sort of if you look at the age crime curve, no matter which group we're talking about or what society we're talking about, the age crime curve follows a very specific curve. Right, a lot of the reduction in crime is because young people are in fact not committing as many crimes, and that's again going back to our opportunity argument that we spoke about at the beginning.
Well, that makes total sense. Let me shift to a little bit of a different take, and I think this is kind of leads us into a different kind of crime. And one of our attendees asked, since we've become so much more reliant on technology, are we seeing an increase in digital crimes like hacking and identity theft and fraud?
100%, 100%. In fact, I just had my lab, right before this, I had my lab meeting with my students and John Hipp, who's the co-director of the lab that we run. And we spent a lot of time talking about crime online in the context of something else. But there is no doubt that we have seen or experienced an uptick in online kinds of crime. The problem with saying much more about this is that we lack access to the data as criminologists. One of the things we were talking about in our lab meeting, for example, was that a lot of the crime that you would be interested in that occurs online, like fraud and that sort of thing, stealing people's identity, credit card theft, that kind of stuff, that data, that information is held by private companies and is not necessarily accessible to criminologists. So it's very difficult for us as criminologists as a field to say much about a lot of white collar structural corporate crime because it's not easily accessible in the way that our Uniform Crime Report crime is. I mean, any one of us here could go to the FBI.gov website and download crime for the whole United States down to the city level, looking at murder, rape, robbery, assault, burglary, larceny, and auto theft. I have no idea where one would go to get identity theft data. And this is partly why our field has not been able to study these kinds of crimes in a systematic way because of access to data. But I'm going to go out on a line. I usually don't like to do anecdotal sorts of things. I'm going to go out on a line here anecdotally and say what I've read and other kinds of studies have suggested that we are in fact seeing a lot of crime that would normally take place on the street shifting online.
Well, and that's interesting because yesterday during our Parkside chat with Susan Charles on supporting seniors, one of the things that came up, not quite online, but via telephone, which is a non-in-person means of connecting with people, that there was a huge concern about seniors being targeted by phone solicitors who are someone to talk to, and how are you doing, and help with the cause. And it kind of goes back to how we started when you talk about opportunity. People who are really motivated offenders just shift to where the opportunity is, and now the opportunity is online or by phone. You obviously need a little more knowledge to be a sophisticated hacker, but as we see the 16 to 24-year-old group become increasingly tech savvy, you would speculate that that's going to be another form of crime that's going to be much harder to follow and to
Well, and
identify.
it's compounded, you're absolutely right, and it's compounded by the fact that potential victims are desperate, right? People are waiting to receive help, economic help and funding, and they're online filing paperwork for unemployment. I mean, there's just so many more opportunities, and people are desperate for help, and so it's much easier to confuse them and confound them and take their money. And so this is where we need to be focusing a lot of our attention and effort, because you've got the perfect storm. You've got opportunities moving online, but you also have victims that are in great need, whether it's economic, financial need, or they're having a lot of stress about their health. People are vulnerable right now. And that in some ways provides another opportunity for would-be offenders.
That's a really good point. And also people are doing things they've never done before. So I know when I get a call, this is the IRS and we're going to arrest you if you don't give me your credit card number, I know that it's not for real. But I wouldn't know if I were filing for unemployment and someone said, this is the California Department of Employment Security and your claim, we need more information on your claim. What's your credit card number to credit it? What's your PIN number? You could see where people would fall prey to that pretty easily.
The thing, that my colleague Volkan Topali and his colleague wrote a really interesting piece in The Criminologist. It's a newsletter for the American Society of Criminology on crime exponentiation and what that means for how criminologists do their job. And in this article, one of the points they made is that as we move more crime online, COVID-19 related or not, the opportunities to offend really just skyrocketed. And they use the example of, if I'm out to try and rob somebody as an individual criminal, I could maybe rob 3 people in the day, right? At max, physically, right? In space. But if I'm an online, if I'm online trying to scam people, I could easily, in the click of a button on my computer, send out phishing emails to thousands and thousands of people. And if 1% of them click back, you can see how quick the damage can be done. And so there's this exponentiation component that I think is really interesting and important for criminologists to consider as we move forward as a field, like what this means for our theory and how we stop crime and prevent this kind of crime, because it really is shifting and looking different online compared to in physical space.
Well, and that gets back to the motivated offender. I mean, if you're motivated, you'll figure out a way to do it. And actually that leads to another question. I'm just going to read 2 more questions here and then our time will be up. This is, people are losing more and more money and resources as the pandemic rages on. Do you think we'll hit a point where people become so desperate that we will start to see a rise in many crimes?
Yeah, this goes back to the conversation at the beginning, which is that the relationship between poverty and unemployment and crime is a very complex one. It seems intuitive that as people become poor, they lose resources, or they become unemployed. It seems intuitive that they would turn to crime to address that need. That happens sometimes, there's no doubt about that. But what's surprising to me is if you look at past research in times when other economic downturns have happened, like I gave the example of the 2008 recession, that doesn't happen in the large numbers that people think it should or would. So I'm going to go with what research and history say on this one and say that now, at some point, will we, is it a nonlinear relationship? At some point when things get so dire, but then of course we have to reconsider that, because there's different levels of economic recession and depression. But if we can go by what we know from the 2008-2009 recession, in fact, we did not see the huge increase in crime that many people predicted would follow such economic downturn.
Well, that reminds me of a quote I read in a book that Christopher Jenks wrote, and he said, if poverty alone caused crime, graduate students and clergymen would be among the top offenders. So
That's a good one. I like
it's a
it.
good lesson that nothing's quite that straightforward. There's a lot of nothing. That's sort of the theme of social ecology too, is that there's not generally a direct cause and effect. And when
Right.
things happen, it's for a multiplicity of reasons that interact in different ways at different points in time and differently in different people. And in a way, we see that lesson with COVID-19. Some people don't even know they have it, and other people die. So it's
I like that. Yeah, I like that because you're absolutely right. I mean, couple things we know: crime is caused by many factors, not just one. So, whether we're talking about poverty or police community relations or guns or anything, it is it's caused by many different factors that combine. And I always remind people of that because we tend to want to look for that silver bullet. What caused crime to go up or go down? And often when I'm speaking to reporters, I'm saying, well, it could be these things. And they want to know the one isolated factor, and crime is multifaceted. And then the second is that context kind of overrules everything. So, you always have to look at an individual or at groups in their context. That context may be in the family, that context may be in the household, in the school environment, it may be in the neighborhood, it may be in a city that has certain policies. But it's always important to look at how these factors impact crime in those contexts, because those contexts often shape individual decision-making, right? We make decisions in contexts that have major repercussions for us. So context matters.
Well, you sound like a spokesperson for our school, so that's very good. As we say, people and environments and the unique relations between them. So I think we have a few more questions, but it's just about 3:30. So I think we'll end, and thank you so much for joining us. The video will be available that we pre-recorded, as well as this video that we are recording. And I think our fantastic communication team of Mimi, Han, and Vivian will be sending this out to you. So again, thank you all for joining. We're going to end the meeting, and I hope you've learned something. I learned something.
Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good weekend. Now I know it's Friday. I don't usually know the day, but it is Friday. So have a good weekend, and goodbye.